Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Diego Bermudez Thermal Shock Wash Process Colombia from September Coffee Company. And there's the bag right there. And September, based out of Ottawa, Ontario. And this is part 3 of our 3-part September series and their third ever appearance on this channel. As once again, this is the coffee company of well-known coffee YouTuber Kyle Russell, and he himself did pick out all 3 coffees that we are featuring in this series. But this coffee did catch my attention for another reason, and that's because it is a Diego Bermudez coffee. And despite the fact that we've reviewed a lot of Diego Bermudez coffees on this channel, we've somehow never reviewed his standard classic Diego Bermudez itself. So this is finally that opportunity to do so. And I'm looking forward to discussing it, as this right here is day 37. And recipe we went with for this coffee was once again our standard recipe, which is a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And this one I preferred through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this one, as I always say, it's a little bit more tricky to tell when it comes to heavier processed coffees. This one doesn't feel quite as light as the previous 2 coffees that we had reviewed from September. Even then, it's still on the lighter side of things relative to a lot of other American and especially Canadian coffee roasters. So I still feel like it's safe to call this one a little closer to a light medium in terms of that roast profile. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and this one went through the V60, and the coffee immediately offered the classic Diego Bermudez-like aroma in the grind itself, but it does settle nicely as it's not quite as heavy or fermenty as expected. And if you've ever had one of Diego Bermudez's coffees, then I think you have a pretty good idea of what I'm referencing, as there's a very strong fruit aroma that's present within grinding the coffee itself. This one right here was a little bit more vibrant, a little bit more mild, but still offered great vibrancy, as there was a beautiful candied sweetness to the cup, the vintage butterscotch-like component with a cleaner red berry aspect as well, so a very positive start. And when I mention that butterscotch, then I'm going to reference Manhattan's version of Diego Bermudez, which is the second Manhattan coffee I ever tried so many years ago. And that's what I attribute to Manhattan as having that very strong brown candied sweetness. It's because that impression I had of them really left a mark with me. So this right here, having it in a slightly more clean sense and a defined manner, was really nice. So it did leave a very positive first impression, a little different and a little cleaner than I might have expected. Day 17, ran it through the Chemex, and this was much more in line with the expectations, as this one came out a little bit more heavy, as it seemed to heighten the lychee attribute to the cup with a red fruit forward component that wasn't quite as heavy or overbearing as I might have expected, but this one definitely did offer a lot of the heavier potential to the cup, with the candied sweetness a little bit more secondary as a result. And honestly, I was seeking out getting a lot more of that kind of butterscotch-like component to this one, so having that be a secondary factor in this cup definitely wasn't necessarily the best. I had a feeling that the Chemex wasn't going to be the ideal brew method for this coffee, but we'll see how that turned out, as on day 20, we ran it through the April brewer, and the cup was back to being much more in line with my first impression, as it seemed to offer a focus on the brown candied sweetness yet again. One thing I should stop and note is that it's interesting this one doesn't have any sort of brown candied component to it, as for me it was very pronounced, and on certain days the most pronounced factor within this coffee, so that's interesting. I would say at this time it was reminiscent of the Werther's original candy, as the red fruit aspect was a little bit more secondary. So the first day and the third day were the best impressions I had had of this coffee up to this point, with me not necessarily liking the Chemex option that we had from this one, but I really liked the definition of the April brewer, and I still have a little bit left. Maybe I'll go back and try it through the April brewer, because that was actually a pretty nice day in general. Day 23, back through the V60 with September's recipe, and it continues to remain on the slightly more subtle side of things relative to the expectations I had had for it, but I was beginning to wonder whether or not it was going to start skewing in the heavier direction, as this one did feel a little bit more vibrant, at least in the red fruit sense. There's a bit more of that fruit brightness as opposed to the fruit heaviness that was experienced from the Chemex, as it's starting to skew a little bit more on the candied side of things just in general, as it does cool down. So another nice day, but it's at this day I began to worry that this coffee might start heading in a direction that I didn't necessarily enjoy. Day 25, We had to try it one more time to the Chemex, and it definitely did not yield the best of results, as it feels a little day and night between these two brew methods, as the Chemex really did seem to accentuate a lot of the heavier components within this one, as it came out a lot more fermenty. There's an extremely strong red fruit forward aspect with an emphasis on the fermenty berry. I've said before, I try to avoid coffees that do say lychee on them, because oftentimes it does come out a little bit more fermenty and heavy than I would like. Less definition and clarity overall, so I opted to stick with the V60 from this point going forward. On day 28, I feel like a lot of my biggest fears were validated as we ran it back through the V60 with our standard recipe, and it just felt like this coffee was naturally increasing in the overall vibrancy as it began to border a little bit more on the fermenty red fruit side of things, as opposed to the cleaner red fruit that we'd experienced earlier. Listed lychee felt a lot more present, strong sweetness, a bit of brightness, but the entire cup felt a little bit more balanced in general. So I feel like this was maybe the last day of this coffee where I was going to really enjoy it, as on day 31, I was experiencing similar attributes as day 28 with a little less clean of a cup in general, a little bit more vibrancy, and increased heaviness though, as the red fruit seemed to be the most pronounced characteristic, as that brown candied sweetness was taking a back seat to that. It was better as it cools, as the lychee did feel a little bit more clean in that sense, but up to that point, it did feel a little bit more heavy than I would like. And day 34, once again, I ran out of space for my notes for this coffee, as it felt like it was at its best on the earlier days, as at this moment, it's skewing a little bit more in the heavy direction with a strong red fruit component. Here on day 37, that's a similar experience as well, as this coffee did seem to take that direction that I don't necessarily enjoy from a lot of these heavier processed coffees. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. All right, and we have one level 5, so let's go through that real quick, and that is the berry fruit level 5. Yes, and once again, as I'm going to mention with this tasting wheel, if it would have been made on a different day, then this tasting wheel would have looked very different, and that's kind of fun to discuss with these September coffees, as the Kenya was extremely consistent, the Ethiopia was a little less consistent, and this one was probably the least consistent of the three coffees. But this one right here, that berry fruit at a level 5, yes, towards the end, the red fruit aspect wasn't quite the overbearing, overly heavy level 5, but even then, it did reach that level 5 because it was extremely pronounced, it was extremely strong. I believe lychee and strawberry are the two things that they have listed on here. Yes, those were experienced right from the start and throughout, but it wasn't until the end of this coffee that I was experiencing it in the most abundance it had been. So level 5 at the end, maybe the lower side of level 5, but honestly, it's a true level 5 for me. Then a bunch of level 4s. We'll start with the finish level 4. That's the biggest and most important takeaway, is if you don't have one of those fruit components and the cleanliness being overly low, the fruit component being too high and the finish being too high, then that says that it didn't necessarily reach the level of too heavy or too overbearing. This one didn't. It is on the higher side of level 4. It did have a very pronounced, long-lasting finish, very much skewing in that red fruit direction. On the earlier days, though, it was a true level 4 and much more in line with the brown candied sweetness. So that changed over time. Even then, it's always going to be at the level 4 mark. Sweetness, level 4. That also increased. That's definitely on the higher side of level 4. I think I mentioned in the Ethiopia video that this was the sweetest coffee of the three that we had reviewed from September. So this one right here, definitely on the higher side of that level 4 for the sweetness. A lot of that early days brown candied sweetness, but towards the end, a lot of those red fruit sweet components to it. Acidity, level 4. Yes, I had also mentioned that there was a fair bit of brightness pretty early on in this coffee. This one, as mentioned, also had a bit more brightness than the Ethiopian coffee, so don't really know what to make of that, but was feeling this bright aspect throughout this one as well. Caramel, level 4. Yes, and as I have mentioned already, if we would have done this tasting wheel on an earlier day, we're going to tone down the berry fruits to maybe even a lower side of level 4, but even then a level 4, the cleanliness we would have bumped up to the level 4, but the caramel would have stayed at that level 4 throughout, as at times it was the most pronounced characteristic for me, at other times it was the second most pronounced characteristic. Definitely much more in line with like a butterscotch, a Werther's Original, but you're really kind of saying the same thing at that point, as it was basically just a very defined brown candy component to this one. Much more in line with the caramel than anything else, but definitely my favorite part of this coffee. It's my favorite part of Diego Bermudez in general, when there is that standard Diego Bermudez coffee that I've had a number of times, just never somehow reviewed it. So caramel level 4, yes, I completely agree with that. And then we have a handful of level 3s. We will start with the body level 3. Don't think I have too much to say on that. So we have a Colombian coffee with the V60, so that's where it pretty much should be. Citrus fruit, level 3, I thought that that was kind of interesting because there was a slight citric aspect to this one. This was a little bit more strong of a cup of coffee, a more vibrant cup of coffee, especially relative to something like the Euchro. So I could pull out a little bit more from this one, including the stone fruit, as at times I was able to get a slight but nice peachy quality to it as well. So that's a really nice positive. Oftentimes when strawberry is listed on there, I'm able to experience both of those in at least somewhat of an abundance. So that's where that comes into play. Chocolate level 3. I would actually say that it was a little bit more delicate of a chocolate as opposed to a heavier chocolate, which I might have expected, but even then it did justify reaching at least that level 3 mark. And then the last thing really worth discussing on this tasting wheel is the cleanliness level 3. On the earlier days, I was super excited to put this at a level 4 because up to the point where it started skewing very strong in the red fruit direction, I was so happy to put this Diego Bermudez, and I was going to say this is easily my favorite of the September coffees because of those early experiences. Right there at that level 4 mark, but it didn't quite hold out throughout. So this one right here, I think it's very much in line with that level 3. I wouldn't even necessarily say the higher side of level 3. It didn't get to the point where it was overbearing, but even then it was heavy enough to not justify the level 4 mark. That's obviously reserved for much more clean coffees, washed coffees in general. So it fought a valiant fight, but at the end of the day, it did settle at that level 3 mark. So I mentioned a lot of caveats on this tasting wheel as well, as this one right here could have looked a lot different if we had done this one on the earlier days. So this doesn't necessarily represent my favorite impression of this coffee, but I do feel like it represents the experience we had towards the end of this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, I think you could probably pick them up from how I've been discussing this one. On the early days, I really liked it, especially through the V60, and I feel like maybe I should have just continued working with those earlier days, because if I would have gone through this coffee maybe in 2 weeks as opposed to kind of extending it out, I might have enjoyed this coffee a lot more than I ended up enjoying it, but I can feel that it's starting to skew in the direction I don't necessarily like. And that's not uncommon for these coffees, as that has happened with so many of these coffees we've reviewed. At the start, I'm really enjoying them, but the more time that they have, the more they skew in a direction that I don't necessarily enjoy. So that's why this coffee at times was one I really enjoyed, and at the end, I would say that it probably ended up being my least favorite of the September coffees that we did review. But towards the earlier days, it was definitely my favorite. There were some nice things that you could take away from this one, which does lead into the type of person I would suggest this coffee to. There too, so it does depend on how and when you wanted to drink this coffee. So if you are like myself and you're looking for a cleaner, much more brown candy forward coffee, then I would say that start this one earlier and finish this one earlier, because when I was able to experience that in a cleaner and more brown candy forward sense, it was a very enjoyable coffee. But then when it started to skew in a direction that I didn't necessarily enjoy as much, that was of course the heavier red fruits, then that's something else I could point somebody towards, because it offers both of those. So even when it was more brown candy forward, the red fruits were a cleaner and nice, more subtle contrast to that. But then towards the end, when it was a little bit more red fruit dominant, the brown candy was still present in it as well, so that complemented it in that sense. So it just kind of depends which coffee you're looking for, a little bit more heavy and vibrant of a cup, or a little bit more brown candy and clean of a cup. It could lend itself to both of those types of coffee drinkers. I think for the most part, I'll leave this review at that. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you enjoyed the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Diego Bermudez Thermal Shock Wash Process Colombia from September Coffee Company. Thank you for watching.